we're going to look at shutter aperture and how they affect exposure. Okay, Chapter 1, what exposure is. Exposure is the measurement of the total amount of light that strikes the film. We have to ensure that when we're taking our photograph, we don't have too much or too little light striking the film. Too much and it just blows the film out, not enough and we don't have an image on the film. This exposure is controlled by the shutter speed and the aperture, and a combination of two of them. We think about exposure as a constant, all right? It's a specified amount of light that we need to hit the film. And it doesn't matter if it's during the middle of the day, if it's in the morning, at night, if it's North America, South Boston, doesn't matter where we are, when we are. We need a specific amount of light to strike the film in order to have a workable negative image. Our shutter speed determines how long the film is exposed for. 1 second, 1/2 a second, 1/1000th of a second. Shutter speed determines the length of time that exposure occurs. The aperture determines the intensity of the exposure. Remember, the aperture is that opening in the lens. It can be very small, very large. If the aperture is very small, you have very low intensity and subsequently need more exposure time in order to create the image. If your aperture is wide open, you have a great deal of intensity during exposure. You use a much shorter shutter speed to record your image. Again, we always think about exposure as being a constant. All right, shutter speed is about time. I'm going to repeat this a number of times. Shutter speed is about time. Aperture is intensity. They both control exposure. They both have creative aspects. But in what we're looking at right now, we're looking at the exposure that's important for us. Every time you press that shutter release, you open the shutter for a specified period of time. 1 second, 1/2 second, 1/15th, 1/30th of a second. And the aperture stops down to its working size, f4, f5.6, f8. And each one of those is a combination of intensity and time that creates our exposure. The length of time the shutter is open, the size of the aperture, they work together to create that precise amount of light hitting the film, the precise amount of exposure that we need. The thing to remember then is anytime you alter one of these variables, you have to alter the other variable to compensate, because exposure is a constant, and one variable requires that another variable be modified. Shutter speed and aperture work as reciprocals, which means as the intensity goes up, time has to go down. As time gets longer, intensity has to decrease. So we have to balance those two between each other. The changes always have to be in balance. The nice thing is once you find that balance, you have a number of workable solutions. But the first thing you have to do is find that balance. Creating exposure can be understood as filling a beaker full of water from a faucet. Turn the faucet on. The shutter speed is that length of time that the faucet is on. We turn it on, turn it off. That's our shutter speed. The aperture is the intensity of the flow. Do we turn it on as little? Do we turn it on a lot? All right, we can have a little drip, 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 or we can have a great deal of flow. So we have to balance the amount of time the water is flowing with the strength of the flow, the intensity of the flow. A large intensity of the flow is going to require only a short fill time. A drip, drip, drip is going to require a much longer fill time. Shutter speed, aperture, balance each other out. Again, shutter speed is time, aperture is intensity. Shutter is time, aperture is intensity. If one increases, the other one must decrease. So if I increase my shutter time, if I have my faucet open longer, instead of a 60th of a second, I have my faucet open for 1 full second. That's a much longer amount of exposure time. a much longer fill time. So I need to decrease my flow as to not overfill my beaker. If I have a great deal of intensity and that water's just rushing out of the faucet, then I only need quick on-off in order to fill that beaker. If one increases, the other must decrease. Again, it's about balance, all right? It's about that balance. Always balance. Chapter 2, measuring exposure. It's great understanding what exposure is. But if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So here's how we take care of measurement. The first thing to understand is we have a range of exposures. We don't have to hit this spot on. Ideally, we want it spot on, and we are going to strive for spot on. But we actually have a small range of exposure values that we can use. We can be slightly over, we can be slightly under with our measurement, and we'll still get a decent photograph. But it's a pretty narrow range. We're talking about 2 stops total. We're talking about 1 shutter speed and 1 aperture, either way from where we want to be. Understanding that range, then, we can look at what we have available to us. All right, so here we have apertures on the top row. We have shutter speeds on the bottom row. It's a confusing layout I have here. I understand that, but work with me. If you look at the scale from left to right, the aperture scale, f2 is a very large aperture. f2.8 gets smaller, f4 smaller, f5.6, all the way down to f22, smaller apertures. Smaller apertures mean less intensity. More intensity on the left, less intensity on the right. Same with shutter speed. 1 second is the longest functional shutter speed that we're going to have on our shutter speed dial. 2 is half a second, 4 is a quarter of a second, 8 is 1/8 of a second. So our time decreases as we move from left to right. Our exposure decreases as we move from left to right. Intensity decreases from left to right. Exposure decreases from left to right. Shutter speed decreases from left to right. Exposure decreases from left to right. Okay. That much we've established. So let's say we put the camera up and our meter tells us that we can take a perfect photograph. We have a perfect exposure at a 60th of a second and f5.6. The combination of this shutter speed and this aperture give us the perfect exposure. Super. So we set it up and I can run around, and as long as the conditions don't change, I can take lots of pictures at a 60th of a second and f5.6. But then I see a little kid jumping up and down in a puddle of water, and I decide, you know what, it'd be really cool to get that water splashing and just kind of, frozen, or the kid jumping like in midair. And I can't do that at a 60th of a second. That shutter speed's not fast enough. So I need to pick something faster. I'm going to pick something faster like 1/500th of a second. So I'm going to change my shutter speed from 60 to 125 to 250 to 500. The problem is, if you look at the scale, I've reduced the exposure 125, 250, 500. I've reduced that exposure 3 times. I've reduced it by half, reduced it by half again, reduced it by half a third time, which means that I'm 1 stop underexposed, 2 stops underexposed, 3 stops underexposed. And we know that we really only have a +1 or +1 or -1 variable here. So I'm off by a couple of stops. So I need more intensity to balance out the lack of time. Since my time is shorter and I have less exposure, I need more intensity to increase exposure. Okay, so how do I do that? I do that by changing my aperture from f5.6 to f4 to f2.8 to f2. Now, if you look at it, I've increased the intensity once. I've increased the intensity a second time. I've increased the intensity a third time. So I've reduced my exposure time 3 times, but I've increased my intensity 3 times. When I do that, I've recreated that balance that I had at 60 and f5.6. The only difference is I've created it by decreasing the time and increasing the intensity. That's the cool thing about this. Once you have that figured out, once you have your initial exposure figured out, you have the whole palette to work with here. So 500 and f2 is exactly the same amount of exposure as 60 and f5.6. And if you look at this chart, I could go 30th of a second at f8. I could go 15th of a second at f11. I could go 1/8 of a second at f16. I could even go down to a quarter of a second at f22 if I wanted to blur the movement. So once you've created that perfect exposure, you can just bounce around and you can choose whatever solution you want because you've created that balance, and using the reciprocals, you can reduce one and increase the other and maintain that balance. Awesome. 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 Okay. So we're going to move on real quickly here to what happens if we accidentally under and overexpose and why it's important. So here's just a neutral negative. All right, there's a goodly exposed negative. You can see some information in the background. The part that looks white, since this is a negative, the part that looks white actually represents something very dark, and the parts that are really dark represent something light. So what does this negative look like as a positive? It looks like this. But in order to create that contrast, in order to create that range of tones, we have to have a properly exposed negative. For negatives of underexposed, you can see the negative is just kind of milky and washed out. Problem is, if we try to print that, we're going to get a real muddy, dark gray print. And subsequently, if we overexpose, you can see that negative is just completely blown out. It's way too thick, way too dark, and that's just going to give us a really light, washed out print. I'll show you. Here's a close-up of it. You can see in the background here, the light areas represent the dark shingles, but you can see the separation between them. You can see texture in the shingles. You can even see texture in the white areas. So that properly exposed negative is going to create a properly exposed positive. Underexposed negative, dark muddy print. Overexposed negative, just heavy, dense, washed out print. And you can't correct it. You can't do anything about it. That's why you need correct exposure. But like I said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So how do we do that? Using our camera's meter. Now, there are different types of meters. There are simple meters and complex meters. It depends on what kind of camera you are using. All right, I'm going to look at some real lowbrow camera meters, kind of camera that I use. Real simple, basic meters. All right, this first one is from a Pentax K1000. And you'll notice that it's just literally a stick, and that stick moves up and down. And there's a plus for too much light, there's a minus for too little light. And you'll notice there's a little break in that icon on the right-hand side. And as long as the stick is in between that little break, as long as it's in between that little open area, if it goes a little up, it's okay. If it goes a little down, it's okay. Ideally, you want it straight horizontal. But if it creeps up or creeps down, as long as it's within that break, you're good to go. That's your one stop up, your one stop down. If it goes into the line, no good knee. Gotta fix it. It's the simplest meter ever made, and it's probably one of the best to work with. This is the first complication of that kind of meter, the stick in the ball, all right, the stick in the hoop. When you change, in this meter, when you change the shutter speed, the stick with the hoop goes up and down. When you change your aperture, the other stick just goes up and down. Now what happens is the two, they cross into each other and they overlap. When they overlap, then you've got the correct amount of exposure. And it doesn't matter if they overlap up here or if they overlap down here. As long as they're overlapped, they're telling you that you have the right exposure. But it also gives you an indication of where your shutter speed is, fast shutter speed, slow shutter speed, large aperture, small aperture. So it gives you a little bit of an indication of where your settings are, not in addition to where your exposure is. This one's just really simple. Green light, green means go. Red light, stop. Red plus, too much light. Red minus, not enough light. Green light, go ahead, take your picture. This one works in the same kind of range. Sometimes you get a green light and the minus, and green light and the plus. As long as you have a green light lit, you're good to go. You're close enough on your exposure, you can take a decent photo. And then this is a more modern version. You'll find this on the more advanced Canon and Nikon and other cameras, like, let's say, 1995 on, that became more electronically driven. In the viewfinder, you'll find this gauge right at the bottom, and it shows you your shutter speed, 1/90th of a second, your aperture, f4.0, and on the right, the ISO of the film, in this case, 200. And in the middle is your meter. It shows you that your meter is in the middle. You have the perfect exposure. You can take your picture. It might float a little to the left. It might float a little to the right. But as long as it's in between the ones, you're good to go, all right? Think of it like as a football goalpost. Keep it between the posts. You are good to go. All right. But again, it's that narrow range we want to pay attention to. You can be off a little. I'm not telling you to be off a little, but I'm saying you can you get a little fudge factor there. You can move it around and still be okay. So it's not all or nothing when you're doing this. All right. It's at +1, -1 range. So, in conclusion, exposure is a constant. Shutter and aperture are reciprocals that we use to try to keep that constant. A change in shutter requires a change in aperture in the opposite direction, equal and opposite. So more time, less intensity. More intensity, less time. When you get your camera, learn your camera. Find a manual. Find it online. Find a video about your camera. Learn it. Sit with it. Play with it. Don't put any film in it, but experiment. Learn how to forward advance the film, and how to change the shutter, how to change the aperture. Put a fresh battery in and play with the meter. Make sure you walk around. Try it inside. Try it outside. Just walk around without film. Play with your camera. Learn how the meter works. Learn how to focus it. Learn how to use it. Become comfortable with it before you start using it. Experiment with it. And make notes about what you're doing, so that you can go back and you can write down. It's like, oh, that's what happened when I was at a 30th of a second. I blurred. Oh, that's what happened when I was at 500th of a second. I wasn't able to get my aperture to a large enough setting to make it work. So you're going to find out what works, what doesn't work, by practice, by experimenting, by making notes.